Okay, good evening, everybody. My name's Dearbhla Doyle. I'm the head of the political section at the European Union Delegation. This was supposed to be the ambassador. Unfortunately, he's indisposed this evening, so I'm just stepping in to give a few short introductory remarks before we get on to the panel, which I know you're all waiting to hear. So, just to note, the European Union has been raising the Pride flag for International Day Against Homophobia, Biphobia and Transphobia for several years. We first walked in Capital Pride in 2019. We were very happy to be able to do it again this year. Congratulations to the Capital Pride Alliance for a fantastic parade after a 3-year absence. Yes. We would also like to thank the Red Bear Brewing Company for hosting us tonight. It's such a great venue, and Capital Pride Alliance for co-sponsoring this event with our delegation. I would also like to welcome our wonderful panelists. We're very lucky to have the US Special Envoy, Jessica Stern, here this evening. We also have two of my diplomatic colleagues, Michael Lavers and from the German Embassy, and Heracles-Spyridon, Aktypis, and I apologize for the mispronunciation from the Greek, as well as Neela Ghoshal, and our panel moderator, Michael Lavers. So welcome to all of them. Thank you for being here tonight, and we're looking forward to hearing also the personal testimonials. I would note that across the world, cultural, traditional, or religious values continue to be used to justify persecution, discrimination, bullying, and gross ill treatment against LGBTQI persons, often involving hate crimes and extreme forms of violence, including torture and murder. It's a very grim picture. In 69 countries, sexual orientation laws continue to criminalize same-sex acts, and in many other countries, the laws do not offer the necessary level of protection for LGBTQI persons, allowing various forms of discrimination to occur every day. That is why we believe that visibility of the LGBTQI community is extremely important, and as you know, that is the theme of our discussion here this evening. Visibility advances the undeniable truth that LGBTQI+ rights are human rights. The European Union is actively working to protect LGBTQI+ persons from discrimination and violence. At the political level, we adopted our first ever LGBTQI equality strategy for 2020 to 2025. And this sets out a number of actions to support the community around the world. It reflects the EU's commitment to building a union where diversity is celebrated as part of our collective richness, and where all people can be themselves without risk of discrimination. The EU continues to be among the top donors worldwide, supporting LGBTQI and civil society organizations and human rights defenders. So I have a few other points here, but I actually think we need to get on to the panel discussion, which is what you've all come to hear this evening. I would just note that this is a very important area of cooperation also between the European Union and the United States, as is human rights more generally, and defending the universality of human rights. So with this, I think I would close, and I expect someone will come up and introduce our individual panel members. I'm very much looking forward to the discussion. Thanks to Ali Kane, our Human Rights Officer, who helped put this together, together with the other organizers. And I hope you all enjoy the discussion. Thank you for being here.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for being here. My name is Michael Lavers. I'm the international news editor for the Washington Blade. It's a real honor for me to moderate tonight's discussion. And just to start off, happy Pride, everyone. And as was previously stated, it's a very, we're living in very complicated and very difficult times, and many of our LGBTQI brothers and sisters face discrimination, violence, persecution, and so forth around the world. And it's important for us to acknowledge that, as it was previously said, but there's also a lot of reason for hope as well. And honestly, we've never been more visible as a community, and that's what brings us here tonight. So I'd like to allow our wonderful panelists to briefly introduce themselves, and then we'll go ahead and get into the discussion. So I'll start with Monika.
Okay. Good evening. So my name is Monika Nemeth, and I am based right here in Washington, D.C. I am an advisory neighborhood commissioner right here in Washington, D.C., which is a local elected office, very hyper-local office, which is unique to Washington, D.C. for those of you who are from out of town. I am the first trans person elected to office in Washington, D.C. history. Thank you. And as part of ANC's, there's close to 300 of us here in DC because it's a very local office. We each have about 2,000 constituents in our district, so we literally have very tiny little districts. All the LGBTQ commissioners here in DC, we formed a caucus called the ANC Rainbow Caucus, and I am currently the chair of the ANC Rainbow Caucus. And so we work on very hyper-local matters, and I also advocate on a number of issues that are of concern to the LGBTQ community here in Washington, D.C. Thank you.
Thank you, Monika. I'm Heracles Aktypis. I'm a diplomat with the Greek embassy here in Washington, D.C., the political section of the embassy. In a previous life before joining the Foreign Service, I worked for NGOs like Amnesty International. And I lived, in France and in Cyprus, so I have what we call the EU experience. So thank you, EU Del, for setting up this. Thank you, Ali, and I'm really delighted to be with you again here.
Hi, everybody. Michael Ahrens, my name. I'm from the German embassy, deputy head of the political division of the embassy. I have no previous life before the Foreign Service. Sorry, just started right out of school. But I've been posted to Asia a couple of times, Shanghai, Seoul. I've worked in San Francisco and in Los Angeles, and very happy to be in DC and on this panel.
Hi, everyone. Ooh, how's the volume? All right. Hi, everyone. How are you doing tonight? Excellent. Happy Pride. My name is Jessica Stern, and I'm the U.S. Special Envoy for the advancement of the human rights of LGBTQI+ persons. How many of you knew that the U.S. had such a position? All 5 of you, you're amazing. I spent my life as a human rights activist. For 25 years, I focused on LGBTQI rights, and I came out of doing women's rights and economic justice work. And then in October, I joined the Biden administration in this position. So I'm based at the Department of State. And what I do is I lead everything that the State Department does as relates to LGBTQI+ rights in U.S. foreign policy across all 77,000 employees. So basically, I'm trying to queer the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and it's just truly an honor to be up here with you all tonight. So we're going to do like a 35-minute-ish or so discussion, and then we're going to open it up to questions from the audience. And so the first question I want to ask the special envoy, actually, and Jessica and I have been friends forever, so that's why I'm deferring to you first. So we're here talking about LGBTQI visibility, and from your position in the State Department, Special Envoy, why is that important to you personally, and also for the folks why is that an important thing for you?
So Michael, as a longtime friend of yours, you repay me by asking me to start off the hard questions. Thanks a lot.
I'll buy you a drink later, I promise.
Okay, all right, great. Okay, so visibility for LGBTQI+ persons is a complicated concept, right? So for some of us, we're hyper visible whether we want to be or not. And sometimes being hyper visible means that we're reduced to our sexual orientation, our gender identity or expression, or sex characteristics. And people actually can't see past that, right? They can't see us as family members, they can't see us as workers, and the consequence is we're subjected to discrimination and violence because we're dehumanized. So that's one kind of visibility, right? It's a sort of involuntary and persecutorial visibility. But there's another kind of visibility that we might call joy, right? And it's the visibility that we have here tonight. And I can't help but think, on the other side of this wall, we could all just be hanging out, flirting, drinking, doing whatever. But we're all on this side of the wall. And why are we on this side of the wall? Because we're hungry for substantive conversations about the state of the world for LGBTQI plus people. And we're hungry for those conversations because the state of the world is not good enough. We want things to change. We want more rights and recognition and respect. And so I think part of what the State Department is trying to do is to center the kind of visibility that LGBTQI plus persons are asking for ourselves. And what does that look like? That means laws and policies that meet our needs. It means community-based organizations that are well-resourced. And it means simple things like this: the ability to come together after work freely and safely. And one of the things that always humbles me in a place like this, and I like to underscore, is that there are many countries in the world where the very simple actions that we're taking right now, coming together, talking about LGBTQI rights, could put us in harm's way, right? We could walk out of here and we could be arrested for having LGBTQI conversations, or someone could take our picture and out us, and we would end up losing our jobs or our housing. So I think the kind of work we're trying to do at the Department of State, Michael, is making sure that LGBTQI plus persons are visible when they want to be, but not reduced to nothing more than visibility, but are seen as their full and beautiful queer selves.
And Heracles, any thoughts on what the special envoy just said in terms of visibility?
So, yeah, for me, visibility, I'm thinking a bit about it as, first, when we really decide to be visible. I think in my case, it was when I stopped having fear, what people will think about me. And then it comes also to the social life, to the social dimension of ourselves. So come out in as a gay person in Greece or in Europe in general is a process, like in the United States. So for me, being visible means also that I set an example for others. Others feel supported so as to come forward and claim their rights. So the visibility is the prerequisite, if you want, for more rights, more equality in our societies, and it is something that we need to do together. We need to fight for more visibility together. If we hide ourselves from the rest of the society, and now I'm referring mostly to societies where you have to hide yourself, otherwise there are criminal sanctions and other repression policies. So we need to come out and talk about who we are, be really ourselves, and claim our rights and full equality.
And my next question is for Monika. You talked about your involvement in local DC politics and a little bit about who you are. Can you talk just a little bit about your personal journey in terms of being a transgender woman and actively involved in politics, and how did you come to a place where you thought you wanted to become involved in that sort of work?
Sure. So, thank you. So, even when I was younger, I always had an interest in public service. And being trans, I just thought, well, that's just a path that's not open to me, realistically. I just thought that was just not open to me. And that's just a path that's not open to me. I just felt when I had this interest in public service when I was younger. And then something changed. Society changed. All of a sudden, you started to see trans people much more visibly. And I realized, wait a second, this is doable. And I decided to just, at that point, okay, let's do this. I put myself out there, and I actually lost my very first election, which was a special election, but then I did run for the general election again, a year later, and I won that election beat the person who beat me, and I've been going strong ever since. And in the meantime, I had been just out there as an activist, working in politics. I see some faces here, people I've worked with in the community, and I think that visibility has been extremely important. And certainly, I know I've grown a lot, so as a personal journey, it certainly has helped me. And I know that as the only trans elected in DC, I've been able to open doors, which has been very important. I can call the mayor, I can call any members, any other electeds, and they treat me like a peer. They hold a much higher office than I do, but it's quite interesting that it's like, oh, wait a second, yeah. I get treated like a peer, which is nice. And it allows me to be effective. We've been able to get some nice things done for the community here in Washington, D.C.
I'd like to ask Michael this next question. Can you talk a little bit about how the German government specifically promotes LGBTQI rights abroad, and talk about your specific involvement in that work, if you could?
Yes, glad to do. Maybe I would like to add a little bit to the amazing comments that Jessica had on visibility, because we had 15 years ago the first openly gay foreign minister, so the first probably cabinet minister who was gay openly. I think visibility for me always had to do also with positive role models, and so you see somebody like this, and then he was traveling to China, bringing his husband along, so really to have something like this, and this is something then also it was not reflected in the politics necessarily at this time, so it was his person, it was just with his person. And now we have a new government since end of last year, and this is a Green Party and Liberals and Social Democrat who have a much active queer agenda than any previous government had. So we have a queer representative, I think you met him in Wilton Park. We have a human rights representative in the foreign ministry we had before, but which is new, we have LGBTQI inclusion concept for foreign policy and development policy to really see how to mainstream in an institution, which is not necessarily easy to change, policies that really consider like what are the politics or what is the effect of projects we finance on the LGBTQI community, not only direct but maybe also indirect consequences. And so this is something, we have special funds, so we finance some projects of human rights defenders, LGBTQI plus defenders in Costa Rica, in Peru, in places where it's difficult, looking at also how to get people from Afghanistan to Germany. But the big task really remains to see how to really mainstream this idea. And it shouldn't be just the fact because you're gay, you're really standing for this, but it should be a task for everybody. And in the end, now we also, the new government subscribe to a feminist foreign policy, and it's not just about women and girls, but also about diversity, and this is something which maybe at the same time can be mainstreamed into the institutions.
And the same question for Heracles. Heracles, talk about how Greece is trying to promote LGBTQI rights within the country as well as outside its borders.
Yeah, first of all, I think that my country, we took some time to start talking in public about these issues. The big change started, let's say, in the 90s, and it was an overall human rights agenda. And the EU, being a member state of the EU, was very pivotal in this, in the big changes in Greece in the 90s. But the LGBTQI plus issues were part of a broader human rights agenda in the 90s. From 2000 onwards, I think that the Greek institutions stepped in. So, as I said, we took some time compared to, France, Germany, the UK. Back then, it was still a member of the EU. So, but in 2008, we had the first law, which was a big revolution in Greece, which means the civil partnership agreement for same-sex couples. Still, we don't have the same-sex marriage in Greece. So I think that now we have for me, it's the bigger step ever. We have a national strategy for LGBTQI issues, completely approved by the government. It's a government document. So all the administration builds on these documents. We have deliverables. And one of the deliverables, one of the pillars, if you want, of the deliverables is how we promote human rights of the LGBTQI plus community across the world. We are a medium-sized country. We were all surprised at the Greek ministry. We received, for instance, guidelines from our Secretary General of our ministry how to welcome LGBTQI plus persons at our consulates across the globe. So, you know, our civil servants have specific guidelines now how to handle these cases. And as part of the EU, and we work closely with, you know, all the tools the EU disposes in terms of financial assistance, the human rights dialogues with 25 countries across the globe, and there is always an LGBTQI plus component to these human rights dialogues. And when I refer to 25 countries, I talk also about countries like Pakistan or China, etc. So there is this leverage that the EU has and the member states have, and we support all the EU initiatives in this regard.
And Special Envoy Stern, I know you're one of the 4 LGBTQI special envoys around the world. Argentina, the UK, and I believe Italy is the 4th. That's a big deal. So what does that mean for you in that position to be that the US is one of 4 countries that has such a position, and what message does that send to the rest of the world and also folks here in this country?
Thanks for the question, Michael. I think it means that we don't have enough special envoys. You know, you can, right? Like, we should radically increase that number. You know, we could have 10 times the number and we still wouldn't be done. We should have a special envoy for LGBTQI rights in every country on the planet, right? Because what we say when we mean a position like mine is we mean having a senior official in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs who's focused on inclusion of LGBTQI plus issues in foreign policy and foreign assistance. And that is sorely needed. So I've just come back from a trip across 7 countries in Asia and Europe, and I met with a lot of ambassadors, and I met with a lot of host governments. And I think the thing that really stands out for me again and again is how under-resourced our community is. And I mean that both at the level of LGBTQI civil society, and I'm sure a lot of people in this room already understand that. Our community-based organizations survive thanks to the generosity of our community and some extraordinary allies, but we're working with very small budgets in spite of the need to have a very big and ambitious vision, right? But on the other hand, governments don't really tend to have the technical expertise because they don't have LGBTQI rights specialists or experts employed. So the thing that most surprised me, Michael, is that I went to Vietnam and I met someone in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for Vietnam who's working as his job on LGBTQI rights. And then I went to Thailand and I was in this very formal room, like, you know when you read the papers and you see government negotiations and like people are like sitting at perfectly set tables with like a glass of water and a beautiful bouquet, and you wonder, can you really negotiate in such a space? Well, I was in that room, and I look across the table, and there's all these Thai government officials with the most adorable notebooks. They've all got these like super cute rainbow notebooks. So at the end of the very formal and serious meeting, I'm like, where'd you get the notebook? They're like, we made the notebooks. So the government of Thailand is putting money into LGBTQI rights in ways small and large. But that's a major step forward, and we need to see that happening from more governments. When I went to Sweden, I asked, do you have a full-time person that works on LGBTQI rights in foreign policy? Okay, the truth is I knew the answer, but I wanted to hear them answer it. And they said, yes. We have someone who divides her time among multiple really important portfolios. And this is the government of Sweden, one of the leaders in the world on LGBTQI plus rights. And so the point I'm trying to make is, even in the US context, I'm one of maybe 15 people with my colleague Stephen Leonelli, who's in the audience, and Reggie Greer, who's in the audience. Maybe 15 people that work on LGBTQI plus inclusion across UN foreign policy, across more than 77,000 people. So actually, we're still not even scratching the surface. And to just sort of conclude, Michael, the point I'm trying to make is not like we need more bureaucrats. Please don't hear it that way. But we do need more government officials who have relationships with LGBTQI community members, who are personally queer, and who have training and expertise to ensure that when governments say they're upholding the rule of law, they're really doing so for everybody. So I think we're just getting started.
And I look forward to covering more of those efforts. And so I'd like to pivot a bit to Monika. We're having this panel against the backdrop of really horrendous bills and laws that are being enacted and I'm not going to mention specific places, but we all know what they are. Certain places across the U.S. and around the world. So, Monika, I'm going to ask you from within the U.S. context, how, just talk about the impact of what's happening in various states across the country, not only on transgender folks, but, trans youth, and how do we counter what is going on across the country? And then I'll broaden that to the European perspective after that.
Okay, so another softball question I see. Okay. How do we counter that? Well, each state is doing this, and each state is going to have... That's a complicated answer, because obviously we're going into an election year right now, so first of all, we have to vote blue. I'm just going to go ahead and say it. We need more Democrats in office, and let's face it, at this point, I think everyone, I know our diplomats are going to have to stay neutral, but we all know who falls on what side of the equation in this day and age. And right now, we have an opposition party that is extremely far right, that is just gone off the deep end. And we need to counter that. Now, how we counter that? Well, here in Washington, D.C., I like to think that we're a model city. I mean, we're very LGBTQ friendly. I'm here carrying forward that message. And hopefully we can be a model to other jurisdictions. But we got to get people out there to actually vote for the leaders that are going to actually implement LGBTQ-friendly policies, are going to actually take care of trans people. Because at this point, we can't even rely on the courts any longer, because the courts have been packed with right-wing extremists who are going to disregard the law. So it's a thorny problem here in the United States, unfortunately, and there's no one-size-fits-all answer. It's going to be a hard battle.
And Michael, I'd like to ask you with the same question, somewhat within the EU context. How can Germany and other EU member states try to combat these efforts and I'm not going to get into specific countries, but these efforts to curtail rights of LGBTQI folks or to further marginalize them? What can your government and other EU states do to kind of challenge that narrative and that effort from happening?
it's a difficult question. Also, like Monika just said, I mean, I don't necessarily see the trend that much in Germany, but of course we have EU member states where you see the trend, and I don't want to mention the names, but it's also difficult for the EU, which is so a community of values, and in the transatlantic relationship that you have people who want to just under pretext, I don't know, turn back the time or whatever they think they would like to do to curtail rights that are here, and they probably are encouraged in seeing also what in some of the states in the US is happening and thinking, if here, so why should we now back out? This is our Christian culture and this is against our values, so it's really difficult. So I think it's really positive role models and show like the benefit diversity has, the benefit also queerness has, and having really a government that embraces it. Sorry, I'm kind of like maybe too close. But, that is something. Not sure if I'm doing something wrong. No, it's better, I guess. So I think this is something that can help to really show a better narrative, to really show that this narrative, which is not, I mean, this is only one issue of the narrative. It's anti-migrants, it's anti a lot of things. It's really kind of it's basically anti-human rights. So to really show the positive agenda and like build on that. But like a direct confrontation and a stronger polarization will not lead to success, I think. Kind of have to try to win over the people without antagonizing them.
Heracles, I'd like to ask you this question. How does the United Nations and other international bodies, what role do these institutions play in championing or furthering the cause of LGBTQI rights, and talk about how Greece plays a factor within these organizations?
That's for me, the question. About the UN and their role in promoting the UN is the right forum, if you ask me, from an idealist, I mean, from a perspective which is more like in what world we would like to live in. But probably practically, it's not we don't see tangible results, or we see them in the long run. So the US and the EU, we do coordinate and collaborate, within the UN institutions, especially the Human Rights Council and its mechanisms, special rapporteurs and other mechanisms. But there we have also member states of the UN which do not share the same approach to these issues, or probably they also share, they do not share at all the same values in this regard. So the debate again is more political, like within our societies. The same applies to the international community. We need to be vigilant. We need to bring constantly all these issues to the public and talk about them. And as democracies, we need to do also a lot of work so as to be more credible vis-à-vis all those who do not share the same values or who fight against what we are trying to achieve. And what do I mean by being more credible? Probably, first of all, being coherent between our actions and our values. So human rights are not, human rights are indivisible, which means that we need to equally promote and protect all human rights, from civil and political rights to, social rights. We live in complex societies and in a new era probably of the world, so the UN is the right forum to give answers at the international level, but we also need to speak, the Western countries and those who share the same values as us, we need to speak again the same language and to make sure that we will keep speaking it in the future, which is not a given anymore.
And Special Envoy Stern, the same question for you somewhat. How does the U.S. and the Biden administration work with the UN and other multilateral institutions to advance LGBTQI rights?
Well, some Americans ask, what is the point of the UN? And I'm from New York City, Holla. Anyway, and if you ask a lot of people in New York City, what do you think of the UN? And they're going to say, ugh, whenever it has a big meeting, it creates so much traffic. The UN actually is much more important than we give it credit. And actually, I think people in other countries are much more keenly aware of how important the UN is and its impact on domestic law. In fact, there are more than 15 countries around the world that say their national constitution has to take into account international law and UN precedent to determine domestic human rights. Can you believe that? So if you're in the US and you're wondering whether the US currently is paying its dues at the UN, you have to realize that the US is often out of step with the global community. But thankfully, the Biden administration and the State Department sees the UN as a really important resource. And I think it's really important that we who care about the rights of LGBTQI+ people realize the UN matters. And I ask you to consider, what if you lived in a country where homosexual status or conduct was against the law? Just imagine for a second what your life would be like, how you would date, how you would go to a friend's party, how you would set up your life with someone else. Now imagine what would happen if you were arrested because you're going about your life in that country. Well, it's very hard to appeal criminal charges that actually are upheld by local courts. So in a situation like that, you want to be able to turn to a mechanism like the UN or a regional body because you don't have somewhere else to go for redress. And redress matters, right? We want recognition of the injustice done to us because we don't always live in countries with governments that are fair and good. So when the US engages at the UN, it has a few core priorities from an LGBTQI perspective. So you may know that there's something called an independent expert on sexual orientation and gender identity at the UN. And this is actually a simple concept, but it's a really big deal. It means that the global community has appointed someone to be seized with the issue of documenting and addressing violations and human rights abuses that LGBTQI people experience. So right now, the US is part of a coalition of governments, along with the EU, that is campaigning for the renewal of the independent expert on sexual orientation and gender identity right now. Because every 3 years, it comes up for a vote in the UN Human Rights Council, and every time it comes up for a vote, we have to fight tooth and nail. And we shouldn't have to fight tooth and nail for something like this, but we do. So that's one of our top priorities right now. And if we had more time, I'd give you even more examples.
And I have one final question before, I have one final question before we open it up to questions, and this question's for Monika, actually. How can we, not only those of us here on the stage, but LGBTQI activists in the US and around the world, how can we help our LGBTQI brothers and sisters in places where, say, homosexuality is criminalized or cross-dressing is criminalized and so forth? How can we help those folks further advance their fight for freedom and equality and just, basic dignity?
Okay, so again, another difficult one because first of all, just give them love, give them understanding, because more than anything else, it's hard. And if you haven't been through it, if you don't understand what it's like, it's hard. Sometimes people just need a hug and someone upon whose shoulder they can cry on. So first and foremost, just be there and listen and understand and be kind. First and foremost. And then, each oppressed person and their circumstance is different, so it's hard for me to give a specific piece of advice because you put yourself at risk for aiding them as well. I mean, I personally would stick my neck out for anyone. But I can't ask everyone to do the same, and I understand that. So I would just simply say, be kind, show understanding, and be there for them. That's the best thing you can do. And if you can do more, given whatever the unique situation is in the place that they are, then find the way to do that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So we're going to open it up to questions now. So I think there's a mic going around.
Test.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So.
You were first here.
Oh, okay. Thank you. I don't think I
I'm
could
good.
stand up, so sorry. I hope you could hear me. My name is Helen Petrozola, and I'm representing Ukraine LGBT Freedom. It is a network of primarily European LGBT NGOs that have come together to support Ukrainian LGBT folks who need help, either leaving Ukraine or moving to a safer place in Ukraine, all sorts of support. And my question has to do with balancing priorities. So I'm very appreciative of what European countries and the US have done to move away from dependency on Russian energy sources, but I'm quite concerned about the pivot toward countries that have an equally as abhorrent LGBTI record. So my question is, how do you balance the priority, for example, to respect and stand up for, speak out for LGBTQI rights, while also, for example, in the case of the Ukraine war, meet a priority for energy resources?
Who wants to take that one? Michael?
Not really want to, but happy to do so. So it's a super difficult question. I remember that in Germany, there's this big tabloid which said, great, moving from one dictator to the next. No, it's kind of like moving from Putin to Qatar but it's really a tough question because I'm afraid that the fossil fuel producers of the world are not necessarily the most democratic countries, and the energy has to come from somewhere. I don't think the US can supply the world alone. And if you look out then, you have Norway, and you have to look at new sources also within Europe, within Africa, but there might be also some problematic countries that are producing gas. So it's a really tough question. I mean, you can only do it in a dual approach, and we have the Green Party, who's both in charge of the Foreign Ministry and the Ministry of Economic Development, not development, but economy and climate in Germany. And I think two things they do, and they're coming from a peace movement, a human rights movement. They're always talking about human rights at the same time, and then talk about energy supplies, but this is not as public as the talks about energy supplies, but I think it's still important to really address it. And you have the World Cup coming up in Qatar, so I think there's many opportunities also to be more vocal about that. And then at the same time, for us to really try to speed up also to reduce reliance on fossil fuels at all. So really not just because now, I mean, climate change is still happening. So now you have to double down on these efforts, and you have to double down on renewables. And this is like a good push to really invest more money into research on renewables, to not have to rely in the long run on these regimes. But in the short run, I'm afraid I don't have a good answer other than really address it when you talk to them.
Compliment, yeah.
Yes, go ahead.
Just to complement what Michael said, and I think now the war in Ukraine accelerated a lot of measures in Europe. I mean, the past 4 months, we adopted a lot of measures which promote the energy diversification, which means, as Michael said, we will be less reliable. I mean, we will rely less on fossil fuel energy from countries which are not necessarily very democratic. And about the balance, more broadly, if we look, at the history, we always had, unfortunately, to strike such kind of balances in our world. And it's unfortunate, but at the same time, it's the reality. What we need to do is to make the reality better. One of the side effects, let's say a positive, if I may so, of this war, it's tragic to say so, it's this acceleration of the European policies in terms of energy independence and diversification.
Other Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you all so much for being here. My question is, from a diplomatic perspective, how do we respond when foreign governments or right-wing populist parties in Europe or in the United States weaponize support for LGBT people and LGBTQ rights as a way to malign, the European Union especially, or Western influence in general, or use it as a scapegoat for domestic political victories? Thank you.
Let's take a few questions just to keep it going. The man in the red, and then I think, go ahead.
Yes, my name is Jim Sweeney. I have a question about the religious traditions in Europe. Europe, of course, has some very, very strong historic religious institutions. For the diplomats, how do you see them? As supporters, as antagonistic, and if so, which ones, and what can we do about them?
And then over here.
Thank you. And thank you guys, thank everybody for coming out here and speaking today. I wanted to ask in particular questions about, I understand that we're here for visibility, and it's very important to see different type of peoples in different type of settings, in different type of communities. But how do we go about making sure that the job is getting done? Because at the end of the day, anybody can be just out there, whether they're gay, straight, like lesbian, anybody can be out there just making things worse rather than making them better. How do we get people in where they're actually doing their job? Forget who they're in love with, but how do we make sure that they're actually helping, and what are some things that are being done in Germany? Also, thank you for bringing up Africa. I wanted to know what the U.S. and the EU were doing to not just talk about sexual rights in Africa, but places like Ghana who are on the come up. They are still having issues with homosexuality and being able to express themselves, but homosexuality isn't necessarily illegal. So it's not illegal in certain states, but people just aren't. Like, there's still a lot going against that. So I would love to see if the panel could speak a little bit more about that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll take the last question first. Maybe the special envoy can talk a little bit about what's going on and what the U.S. is doing in Africa specifically, and we'll go from there.
Michael, maybe I'll just speak to a couple of things.
Sure.
First of all, thank you very much for your question. I just want to say there's no religion that has a monopoly on hate, and there's no religion that has a monopoly on love. And I think that looking at a specific faith tradition and thinking that it's inherently pro or anti-LGBTQI is maybe a more narrow interpretation than we would want. I think actually what we need is to recognize that there are LGBTQI plus people of faith across every spiritual tradition imaginable. And there are homophobic and transphobic people, and anti-women and pro-discrimination people that use faith to justify those views in every tradition. I think the question that comes to mind, inspired by what you said, is what are the solutions, right? How do we fight religiously motivated homophobia and transphobia? And I think one of the ways is by lifting up the voices of queer people of faith and supporting them. You know, I was just at a conference with some colleagues, including Stephen and Julie and others, at the ILGA World Conference in California. And ILGA is a global LGBTQI rights organization. And I went to their global interfaith network meeting. And there was the most beautiful Eid celebration ever. And one of the things that people said is, this is the first ever Eid celebration at a global LGBTQI rights conference. And I was just imagining, although I'm not Muslim, how much more seen queer Muslims felt at that conference and how much more supported. And I think we as queer people that want to hold each other up, we have to be better at making space for each other. So that's just sort of one macro level comment that I think is really important. And I think it's important because when the opposition to LGBTQI rights uses religion to justify their hatred, they're distorting what religion can really do. And I think we have to challenge those arguments. On the question of, so the person in the white button-down shirt asked, what do we do when governments manipulate LGBTQI rights in the spirit of populism, anti-democratic tendencies, but with very serious consequences? How many people here followed the recent election in Hungary? How'd it go? Complicated, right? So, if you were following it, you would know that there were 5 referendum questions put on the ballot the same day as the national election for the head of state. Now, imagine you're trying to drive out votes. You can put any question on the ballot, right? Anything that you think is going to generate votes for your party. Well, if you've got an anti-LGBTQI agenda, what kind of questions are you putting on the ballot? You're putting anti-LGBTQI questions up. So 4 of the 5 questions in Hungary's recent national election were explicitly anti-LGBTQI. And I think it's really important to say this because it speaks to exactly what the person in the white button-down shirt was saying, which is that LGBTQI people are often used to drive and distort elections. And it's not for the good. I was actually thinking as you were speaking, Monika, how often LGBTQI people are afraid when it's election season, right? Why are we afraid? Because we know that there's going to be hate speech targeting our communities. So I think the answer is actually to see through the tactics. And the colleague over here, I'm not sure where she went, but she was asking about Ghana. Well, actually, you know, LGBTQI issues and the proposed legislation being considered in Ghana, it's not really about LGBTQI people, is it? It's really a fight between the opposition party and the people that are in power. And LGBTQI plus people are the political casualty. And in fact, if that bill passes into law, it will be the most strict anti-LGBTQI legislation in the world. So we really hope it doesn't pass.
We have about 5 more minutes, and I'd like to take a few more questions if we could. The man in the, I'm sorry? Someone over here has a question? Yeah.
Well, my question did get somewhat answered. I want to reflect, and I'm going to make this a little bit neutral, since we got that EU and US logo going right there. But I think we, in voting season, and it's that time of the year again where I come from the Midwest, where I grew up in a very hateful-filled area. And when it comes to this time of the year, we in DC are so unique. I work for the government here. I'm very happy to be able to fight discrimination, increase understanding, everything. But I have become a little callous to the outside world. And then as we see election in certain parties or anything, not just the speech or anything, start to drive us down and make us negative and just really almost nervous to turn on the news or read anything, how do you keep that positive thought going on if there is, like, I'm going to say this in a very vague way, say like a maroon wave that's possibly coming along or something that other people say, but how do you keep an attitude with that from a group whose queer elders, you know, have took the brunt of the AIDS crisis and stuff, who we don't have the ability to turn to and talk to and say, what's going on here? Yeah, that was really intense. Sorry about that.
That's okay. Nicholas?
Thank you. Thank you very much. My name is Nicholas Mawanda, and my question goes to the diplomats on the panel. it's a two-piece question. One is, what are some of the ways we can hold governments accountable to the prosecution, to the murders of LGBTIQ plus individuals, especially those in Africa and Asia? I will give examples. A few weeks ago in Kenya, we saw a lesbian who was gang raped and killed in their own home. How are we holding those governments accountable? We see masses of immigrants, of LGBT folk, fleeing their own countries, including myself. How are we holding those countries accountable to those? Still with the accountability piece, we continue to see government criminalizing LGBT persons, even those who are living with HIV. Meaning we are actually extending the epidemic of HIV and AIDS. Instead of finding ways to eliminate it, we are actually extending it because this government continue to criminalize and limit and aid and abet discrimination. So those are my questions. And if there is any progress, I know, Jessica, you give an example of Thailand, that there's been some kind of progress. But what, if you're engaging with them, what is the progress? These are our homes, these are our lives. They're not gonna any, you know. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And I saw one more, there was one other question. Yeah, the man in the white, person in the white.
Thank you. I want to build on the last question and ask about development aid spending, which I think is a key instrument of foreign policy, specifically for the U.S. Special Envoy. So if you look at the countries which receive the most expenditure, the most money from the U.S. in terms of foreign aid, are countries which persecute LGBTI people. So I would like to understand to what extent are you working to peg development aid spending to markers of inclusion in these countries. So you asked us a question to imagine what it's like to live in a country where you can't be gay or you'd be arrested for engaging in same-sex activity. So I would ask back, imagine what it's like to live in such a country, and that country is receiving 800 million or 900 million US dollars in foreign aid, as is the case in Ethiopia, from the US. So I want to understand how we can change that to promote inclusion.
Thank you. Who wants to, I heard two kind of pieces, accountability and, you know, what does that look like? So Michael, maybe, you know, how does Germany hold folks accountable for LGBTQI rights?
I think you cannot maybe call it accountability, but a bit builds also on what you said. It's more incentive, really. If you have, I think our biggest incentive or leverage is really development assistance, and really have with countries, big recipient countries, at least for Germany, every 2 or 3 years consultations where you go through the whole agenda and bring up everything, and then really bring up these cases there and also make conditions on what has to improve or what you want to see. And this is not accountability in the narrow sense, because accountability in the narrow sense, you can look at the UN, you can look at the SOGI, and but then of course it's also can be felt more symbolic for the victims, because it's not really accountability in a court of law. But I think the biggest leverage is development assistance, and our inclusion concept for development assistance has only been released March 21, and we're in the first steps on implementing it. So it remains to be seen how, because you always have so many aspects that play into it, so how can you really use this? But I think that's the biggest leverage, and maybe a part of accountability, maybe not really satisfying for the victims.
Special Envoy, anything you want to add to Michael's remarks real quick?
So the person, now not in the white long sleeve button down, but in the white short sleeve button down, asked, what do we do when the US or the EU provides development assistance to countries that discriminate against LGBTQI plus persons? Well, the first answer I have is that every country discriminates against LGBTQI plus persons. And I think it's really important to say that, because if we take an imperial model And we just think, we in the US have it all right. We have all the answers. But we're going to tell every country that we provide development assistance to exactly what they should do. I think that is a very complex and I would say problematic dynamic. But I think you were probing deeper than that. I mean, the core question and the question that's debated is, what kind of aid conditionality is appropriate? Because the truth is, all aid is conditional. All aid is conditional, right? So whether it's conditional on lack of corruption, clear accounting, funding actually reaching the recipients that are intended from the program, aid is conditional. But on the LGBTQI space, this is a profoundly difficult question. Because if a government like the US or like Germany or Greece is providing development assistance to a country for access to education for school children, or clean drinking water, or I think Nicholas was talking about HIV prevention, right? You don't want to take that money away because a country has a history of colonial era sodomy laws, right? And homophobic and transphobic cultural practices. But you also want to ensure that the kids that go to school, the kids that go to the clinic, the money is distributed without discrimination and violence, and everybody has equal access. I'll give you one example of what I'm doing about it, because the vast apparatus of US foreign assistance is much more complicated and unfortunately far out of my own sphere of influence. The most important thing I'm doing on this issue is the most nerdy and the hardest to talk about in a bar. But my office is spearheading a rulemaking process for trying to ensure, actually modeled on the excellent rule that was created by USAID several years ago during the Obama administration. But we're spearheading a rulemaking process that hopefully would influence all foreign assistance to ensure that LGBTQI+, to ensure that foreign assistance provided by the US government cannot be provided on discriminatory grounds on any basis. Not race, not gender, not ethnicity, not sexual orientation, gender identity, or intersex status. So it's a long, slow process. We started the day I started at State, and I'm told that from where we are now, it's probably going to take a year to get over the line. But that's how we do it. Some of the work comes in this really tedious bureaucratic work of making rules that ensure discrimination doesn't happen.
And I want to end with the comment that Tyler made earlier about how do we stay positive in spite of everything that's going on, whether it's an election cycle or, all of the other things we talked about. So, Monika, how do we stay positive as an LGBTQI community when it may seem like we're always under attack and people are trying to silence us and deny us our visibility? So, how do we stay positive?
Well, this is Pride Month. Let's start with that. And here in DC, we just had a spectacular Pride Parade and a spectacular festival. We hadn't had that in a couple of years because COVID shut that down, and we came roaring back, and it was a huge success. So, how do we stay positive? We come together as a community and we let them know we are here and we will stay together as a community because we are strong and we will prevail. That's how we do it.
I think that's a wonderful way to end it. So I'd like to thank Capital Pride. I'd like to thank Red Bear Brewery for hosting us this evening. I want to thank our amazing panelists for being here and for sharing their insight and wisdom with us. And thank all of you for being here. Happy Pride. And we're going to be around for a little bit if you want to come talk to us. Thank you all so much.